Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Yemima, Cedric, and Ronan for thinking and organizing this wonderful conference, which is a unicum and also a provocation in the intellectual landscape of Jewish philosophy. It will have been a great pleasure for me to be with you today, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present online. In my contribution today, I will bring Martin Buber's Ich und Du into conversation with Adriana Cavarero's philosophy of the narratable self, as described in her book relating narratives, storytelling, and selfhood, which sounds better in Italian with the title Tu che mi guardi, tu che mi racconti, you who look at me, you who tell me. The main claim of Cavarero's book is to show how the narrative models could offer a new way in the philosophical and political discourse about the formation of subjectivity and identity based not on categories or general norms, but on the uniqueness of the life story. Following Cavarero's philosophy, I would like to read the primacy of relationship in Buber's thought as a dispositive for a philosophy of narrative. If, according to Buber, in the beginning is relation, can we say that the I can be fulfilled through a narrative relationship with the thou? Would it be possible to compare Buber's idea of relation with Cavarero's female narrative? What elective affinities are there between these two conceptions? In my opinion, this Vergegnung, this mismeeting, misencounter, the neologism that was already mentioned today, the word Buber invented in his autobiography to refer to the failure of a real meeting. So this Vergegnung between the two thinkers, albeit with some differences, could help to shed light on some unexpected features and also potentials of Buber's Frauendenken in the hope of contributing to the debate triggered by this conference. There are at least three elements that allow us to compare Cavarero and Buber. These comparative terms are also the axis on which my presentation is structured. No surprise, I tell you that already at the beginning. First is the opposition between philosophy and narration for Cavarero and experience and relation in Buber. Second is the necessity of the other, not only as a theoretical endeavor, but also as a practical and linguistic necessity for the becoming of the I, as the pronominal ethic of both attests. And third, what I call, and I try to explain it later, a narrative ontology that can be seen as the common thread between the two thinkers. Let's start from Cavarero, who in the book already mentioned makes a distinction between narration and philosophy as two different discursive registers. If philosophy can be defined as a discourse that considers the universality of human being, narration is a biographical knowledge that concerns the unrepeatable identity of someone. So the failure of philosophy is to be trapped in definitional categories that prevent naming who someone is uniquely. Cavarero's counter-movement consists in starting from the existence considered as the exposure of the self to the other, and this exposition entails the narratability of the self. That is something unique, because to be exposed is to generate a life story. So the narratable self is the house of uniqueness, I quote. Or in other words, uniqueness is concretized in a narratable self. Appearance and exposition to others in the world generates stories. And Cavarero writes that only in the absurd case of a life spent in complete solitude would the life story be the paradoxical story of, I quote, unexposed identity without relations and without world. So the narratability of the self is not a monological product of a metaphysical subject. It's not an autobiographical exercise in which the self is narrated and not narratable, but rather it is always a reciprocal and a dual process. So the tales of our story begins with our birth, but our story, far from being a solitary experiment, reveals the interaction between unique people. There is, of course, a reciprocity of actors, as each one is both actor and spectator, subject and object, even if these terms are ambiguous and should be only used in a personal experience. But it is only in this reciprocity of gazes that the identity construction happens. So the intercourse between the narratable selves are also stories in the form of friendship, in the form also of love relationship. For Cavarero, the real answer, for instance, to the Delphic oracle, Gnotis Euthon, cannot lie in an autobiographical narrative, but by the retelling of my story by another, as is the case, for instance, Cavarero argues with Gertrude Stein's autobiography of Alice Toklas, so who was her friend and her lover. So the narrative of the other is the mirror that reveals not only the uniqueness, but also the unity of our story that we desire to hear, the unity that is conveyed through the story of one's life from another mouth that can tell our story because of our constitutive exposition. This means that disjointed lives can achieve an unstable and insubstantial unity through the telling of one's life story by another. So the other then is always necessary. The narratable self is essentially related to other and is seen as a unique being. Why should a philosophy of narration be considered feminist? Cavarero claims that women have a privileged position because they are excluded from what she calls the old game in which self-representation is entrenched. In this way, narration can be seen as the only antidote that saves philosophy from an anthropocentric symbolic order based on the sacrifice of the particular. In contrast to phallologocentric philosophy, narration can be seen as a dispositive oriented toward the disclosure of a unique existence. And this uniqueness represents the feminine resistance of the particular, which cannot be subsumed under universality, and that philosophers since Plato have tried to rescue from its finitude. Narration intervenes to save philosophy from its tragic fate based on an eternal act of erasure of the particular. To tell one's story is, I quote, to distance oneself from oneself, to double oneself, to make of oneself another, end of quotation. The narratable self, which is not a classical subject with its power of appropriation, is the figure through which Cavarero rethinks, I quote, a relational ethic of contingency, an ethic founded on the altruistic ontology of the human existence as finite. End of quotation. So for Cavarero, there is always a reciprocal exposition of the whose ontological status is as exposed, relational, altruistic, totally external. So in this way, she refuses the rhetoric of alterity that characterizes 20th century philosophical discourse. Her idea of a reciprocal appearance is rooted in life, in an existence that is uniquely in flesh and bone, a unique form that defies categorization. The thou is a rest that can neither be digested nor dissolved to construct a common identity. If in modern and contemporary politics and ethics, the thou has become superfluous, for Cavarero, the thou comes before the I in a kind of subversion of the morality of pronouns. Indeed, she rejects the third person perspective. Me or your uniqueness is exposed to your or my gaze and consists in an unrepeatable story fundamental for our subjectivity. Let us now come to the part of Buber. In Ishindu, the I is not taken by itself, but is always embedded in the primary words I, thou, and I, it. These pairs of words are two different modes of existence. The distinction Cavarero makes between philosophy and narration is comparable to Buber's opposition between experience and relation, between Erfahrung and Beziehung. So the first belongs to the primary word I eat, where each eat is bounded by another thing, while the second refers to I thou, where du grenzt nicht, thou has no bound, and there is nothing, but the speaker takes her stand in relation. Standing in relation is antithetical to experience. He wrote, Erfahrung ist du ferne. So the real encounter cannot be the product of receptive or cumulative experience. There is also a difference between the I of the primary word, I eat, and the I of the primary word, I thou. So if I eat appears as an individuality distinguished from the others and as a subject of experience and use, the latter, I thou, is a person who becomes aware of herself as subjectivity, namely by entering into a relationship with other person. This means that the I thou is a reciprocal process in becoming, a process of sharing without appropriation. Like Cavarero, Buber acknowledges that, I quote, where there is no sharing, there is no reality. The more direct the contact with the thou, the fuller the sharing, end of quotation. For Buber, the meaning of the relation between I and thou is mutuality. It affects me and the other. It means being chosen and choosing, suffering and action. As for Cavarero, so for Buber, there is a reciprocal action and a simultaneity of acting and being acted. This also means that the thou is not the result of a search, but it happens, I quote, through grace, without a conscious choice, without a conscious decision or awareness, but in the cradle of real life. For Buber, all real living is encounter. He wrote, alles wirkliche Leben ist Begegnung. This means that the relation with the thou is immediate. There is Mittelbarkeit der Beziehung, an immediacy of relationship that doesn't require the mediation of any infrastructures, of ideas or knowledge, nor any theological element or anticipation. He wrote, I quote, every means is an obstacle. Only when every means has collapsed does the meeting come about, end of quotation. There is a risk, and the risk is that every thou in the world can become an it. There is an essential reification through objective speech, but as Buber said, I quote, objective speech snatches only at the fringe of real life. So if every response tends to transform the thou in the world of the it, there is still the becoming of real life, the midst of living beings, which opposes this process of reification. Buber uses a meaningful metaphor in distinguishing the it and the thou. The first is an eternal chrysalis, while the second, the eternal butterfly. This emphasis on the real encounter can be seen in harmony with Cavarero's insistence on concrete practice. The thou is not only a theoretical element, but also a concrete encounter that is central to Buber's efforts. Both Cavarero and Buber develop a kind of pronoun ethics. The use of pronouns, therefore, plays a central role as they are embedded in a narrative that rejects any kind of universality. I, you, and it are ways of speaking of a subject, of an object that is not universal, but is deeply connected to the realm of life experience. And by insisting on concrete practices, I think that the relationship between I and thou in Buber has not only a nominal or a normative flavor, but also a more concrete approach and a narrative dimension. At the beginning of Ich und Du, Buber admits that the existence of the I and the speaking of the I are one and the same. But the narrative dimension is perfectly explained in the third part of Ich und Du, where Buber speaks of the sphere of the world that concerns our relationship with other human beings that interest us in this context. Here, the relation is manifest and forms language which is seen in its dynamism, since there is also a reciprocity of the word. He writes, the word of address and the word of response live in the one language. I and thou then stand not merely in relation, but also in the solid give and take of talk. End of quotation. So in the moment of speech, the relational moments are bound together and the thou is given a full reality. So in this section of the book, there is a passage that has also a touch of Cavarero. Buber writes, I quote, here alone, then as reality that cannot be lost, are gazing and being gazed upon, knowing and being known, loving and being loved. End of quotation. So the reciprocity of the encounter really happens in the sphere of speech, becomes manifest in language. This tendency to link narration and real life, as well as the narrative dimension of the encounter in real life, is evident in the retelling of the Hasidic legends. Buber places himself, for instance, in this context of the Hasidic legends, in the chain of narrators, a link between links, he writes, who must pass on to further generations the legend he received from the folk books and also from the living mouths of the people. It is not by chance that Borges, who read and translated Buber in his youth, was astonished when he discovered that Buber was a philosopher, not a poet. Borges writes that he accepted Buber's books because they came to him through poetry, through suggestion, and not as arguments, in a similar vein to the Sussman's review of Buber's Hasidic tales quoted this morning. So the final element of the comparison between Cavarero and Buber consists in what I have called a narrative ontology. As we have seen in Cavarero, there is an altruistic ontology based on an exposure and affinitude of the self, which needs the gaze and the word of the other. Buber also states in Ich und Du that relationship is first seen as a category of being. That is, as a readiness of the eye to relation that is due to an a priori that is the inborn thou. This inborn thou, however, is not just an asymptote or an noumenon, but I would say that is a precondition that manifests itself only in a real encounter. Moreover, for Buber, the Teilnahme, so the process of sharing of the I, makes the person aware of herself as a sharing in being, as a co-living being, as a Mitzion. Mutuality and relations have an ontological connotation. For both Cavarero and Buber, the existence of the thou precedes and makes possible the existence of the I. There is a mutuality of relation and a reciprocity that is not theoretical, but manifests through language. However, if for Cavarero, the void between the I and the thou is filled only through the narration of one's life story, for Buber, there is not only a living language, but also a theological heart that is supralinguistic on the edge of silence. Indeed, the main difference between Cavarero's and Buber's approach is in the fact that for Buber, there is a theological approach and a defense of the religious sphere, since the eternal thou is in the background of every thou we address, or in other words, I quote, every particular thou is a glimpse of the eternal thou. For Cavarero, there is not theological discourse, but rather a horizontal community of narratable selves. For Buber, everything is gathered up in the absolute relationship with God, but the true community is an achievement that can be seen the same of the relationship between God and human being. For this reason, I think that Cavarero's horizontality based on an altruistic ethic is not so far from Buber's discourse on true community. For a conclusion, I would like to briefly mention another narrative stance in Buber's thought that, as we have seen, is not only a theoretical cornerstone, but also a sort of way of life, or better, a gift. Buber, the intellectual who strives for a genuine dialogue, has shown in his life, and especially in his letters, as we have seen today, the necessity of exchange and Begegnung. In two famous cases, as after the death of Gustav Landauer and Franz Rosenzweig, Buber carried the stories of his deceased friends on his own shoulders. There is a wonderful verse by Celan, Die Welt ist fort, ich muss dich tragen, that perfectly reflects Buber's commitment after the death of his friends. After Landauer's death, Buber administered his friend's literary estate, edited and published many of his works, and endeavored to spread Landauer's ideas in various Zionistic circles and early kibbutzim movement in order to give the seeds of Landauer's anarchy, blown away by history, a new chance. As for Rosenzweig, Buber, thanks of course to the crucial mediation of Edith, Rosenzweig's wife, famously brought their joint project of translating the Tanakh to completion, giving to him the opportunity and the gift, as the same Rosenzweig highlights, to work and live in the two languages he loved. There is a wonderful sentence in Cavarero's book in which she explains the difference between acquaintances and friends. If the former do not doubt that we have a story, only our friends are able to tell it. In the two cases of Landauer and Rosenzweig's deaths, Buber was not only able to tell his friends' stories, but in an act of pure friendship, he assured them of a legacy and continued their interrupted discourse, giving them his voice to complete their unfinished works. Like a modern Sherazade, Buber dispels death through storytelling, continuing an impossible dialogue and an invaluable narration. Thank you for your attention.